In 1960, it took 6 weeks to erase $2 million from the earth. Wrecking crews arrived at dawn on a cold spring morning in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. They stood before Stonehurst, 60 rooms of English limestone, hand-carved oak, and imported Italian marble, and began swinging sledgehammers. By summer, it was gone. 12 suburban ranch houses stood where America's grandest estate had been. No plaque, no memorial, nothing. But 30 years earlier, this house was everything. There's a photograph from 1928. Black and white, slightly faded. A young man stands at the entrance of a mansion that looks like it was transplanted from the English countryside. Limestone walls rising 3 stories. Ivy climbing toward leaded windows. Gardens stretching toward Lake St. Clair in the distance. The man is Edsel Ford, 35 years old. Son of Henry Ford, the richest industrialist in America. He's holding his infant son's hand. He's smiling, but if you look closely, there's something in his eyes. Exhaustion, maybe, or resignation. He spent 2 years building this house. $2 million. Hired the best architects, the finest craftsmen. Every stone, every window, every garden path was chosen with obsessive care. He would live here for 15 years. Then he would die. And then, slowly, the house would die too. This is the story of what happened inside those limestone walls. A story about brilliance and decay walking hand in hand. About a family that built a monument to prove they belonged among American royalty and discovered that monuments can become prisons. About how even the most powerful dynasties fracture from within. And about the dark truth that no amount of wealth, no perfection of design, no grandeur of vision can protect you from the one thing that breaks everyone eventually: the need to be seen, to be valued, to be enough. Stonehurst stood for 33 years, but what it witnessed, what it hid, lasted much longer. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Edsel Ford never had a chance. He was born in 1893 into a family that didn't exist yet. Not in the way the world would come to know it. His father, Henry Ford, was still struggling, still experimenting, still years away from the Model T that would make him a legend. Edsel's childhood was normal, modest even. But by the time Edsel turned 10, everything changed. The Model T launched in 1908. Within 5 years, Henry Ford wasn't just successful. He was a phenomenon. Half of all cars in America were Model Ts. The Ford Motor Company became the largest automobile manufacturer on Earth. Henry Ford became the richest man in America, and Edsel became the heir to an empire. There was only one problem. Edsel wasn't like his father. Henry was blunt, aggressive, supremely confident. He believed in gut instinct over analysis. He trusted no one completely and surrounded himself with yes-men and spies. He was also cruel in quiet ways, mocking people who disagreed with him, holding grudges for years, punishing perceived disloyalty without mercy. Edsel was soft-spoken, thoughtful. He loved art and music. He sketched car designs in notebooks, focusing on curves and elegance rather than just function. Where Henry saw cars as tools, cheap, reliable, identical, Edsel saw them as expressions of beauty. Henry noticed, and he didn't approve. "Boy's too sensitive," he'd mutter to his executives. "Thinks too much." But Edsel was still his only son, his only heir. So in 1918, when Edsel was just 25 years old, Henry made him president of Ford Motor Company. It should have been a coronation. Instead, it was a trap, because Henry never actually gave up control. He stayed on as chairman and made every major decision himself. He installed loyalists throughout the company, men who reported directly to him, not to Edsel. Whenever Edsel proposed something Henry didn't like, he'd simply override him, publicly, in front of other executives. Edsel wanted to update the Model T, which by the early 1920s was losing market share to Chevrolet. Henry refused. The Model T was perfect, he insisted. It would never change. Edsel pushed for better worker conditions, reasonable hours, safer factories. Henry hired Harry Bennett, a brutal ex-boxer, to run the company's service department, which was really a private army of enforcers who intimidated workers and crushed union organizing with fists and clubs. Edsel advocated for beautiful design, cars that people would be proud to own. Henry mocked him, called his ideas fancy and effeminate. Every time Edsel tried to step forward, Henry shoved him back. But Edsel couldn't leave, couldn't rebel. Because leaving meant abandoning the family fortune, betraying the Ford name, disappointing his mother Clara, who begged him to keep the peace. So he stayed. He smiled through the humiliation. He worked 16-hour days trying to prove himself. And slowly, quietly, the pressure began to crush him. By 1926, even Henry couldn't ignore reality. The Model T was failing so badly that Ford's market share had collapsed. Desperate, Henry finally relented and allowed Edsel to design a replacement. Edsel threw himself into the project. He sketched obsessively, studied European design, consulted engineers. The result was the Model A, sleek, modern, elegant. Everything the Model T wasn't. It was a massive success. 4 million sold in 2 years. It saved the company. But Henry never thanked him. Never acknowledged that his son had been right. Instead, he told reporters he'd approved the design himself, that it was his vision. Edsel said nothing. He never did. But something inside him broke that year. A quiet, permanent fracture. And that's when he decided to build Stonehurst. In the spring of 1926, Edsel Ford bought 10 acres of prime lakefront property on Lakeshore Drive in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Grosse Pointe was where Detroit's elite lived. Old money. Industrial barons. The kind of families who summered in Newport and wintered in Palm Beach. The Dodges lived there. The Fires. The Algers. Names that controlled steel, shipping, banking, and now the Fords. But Edsel wasn't just buying land. He was buying legitimacy. A seat at a table his father would never be invited to, not because Henry lacked money, but because he lacked refinement. Henry was rough, common. He'd rather spend time with farmers and factory workers than attend a society ball. Edsel was different. He'd traveled Europe, collected art, married Eleanor Clay, whose family were pillars of Detroit high society. He understood that wealth alone wasn't enough. You needed taste, culture, the right kind of house. So he hired Albert Kahn. Kahn was the most famous architect in Detroit, maybe in all of America. He'd designed Ford's massive factories, including the Highland Park plant where the assembly line was born. But Kahn wasn't just an industrial architect. He also designed mansions for Detroit's wealthiest families. He understood how to translate power into stone. Edsel gave him one instruction: build me something permanent. Kahn designed a sprawling English manor inspired by the Cotswolds. Not a flashy French chateau like the Vanderbilts built. Not a gaudy Italian palazzo. Something quieter. More tasteful. The kind of house English nobility had been living in for centuries. Limestone was shipped from England, the same quarries that supplied Oxford and Cambridge. The stone was hand-cut and fitted by European masons. The roof was slate, imported from Wales. The windows were leaded glass, custom-made in workshops that had been operating since the 1600s. Inside, the Great Hall rose 2 stories, with vaulted ceilings and exposed oak beams. The wood paneling was hand-carved in England and shipped in sections, then reassembled by master craftsmen. A grand staircase curved upward, each step carved from a single piece of oak. There was a music room with a Steinway grand piano and walls lined with silk damask. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves stocked with first editions: Dickens, Austen, Thoreau, Whitman. A formal dining room that could seat 30 guests beneath crystal chandeliers. 60 rooms in total. Servants' quarters, a ballroom, separate wings for the children, bathrooms with marble imported from Italy, a kitchen large enough to employ a staff of 10, and the gardens. Edsel hired Jens Jensen, the most celebrated landscape architect in America. Jensen designed in the prairie style: native wildflowers, meandering paths, naturalistic plantings that looked wild but were meticulously planned. The gardens stretched from the house down to the lakeshore, Birch groves, a sunken garden with a fountain, stone walls covered in climbing roses, hidden benches where you could sit and watch the sailboats on Lake St. Clair. It took 2 years to build. The final cost, $2 million. In 1927, that was an almost incomprehensible sum. Henry Ford himself, the richest man in America, had built his own estate, Fair Lane, for less than half that. The average American family earned about $1,500 a year. Edsel had spent the equivalent of 1,300 lifetimes of labor. And when it was finished, when the last stone was set and the last rosebush planted, Edsel stood on the front steps with Eleanor and their 4 children and looked at what he'd built. It was perfect. Every detail, every line, every carefully chosen stone. But perfection has a cost, and Edsel was about to find out what he'd really paid for. Eleanor Clay Ford was the perfect wife for a man like Edsel. She came from Detroit aristocracy. The Clays had been prominent since the city's founding. She was educated, cultured, fluent in French. She played piano beautifully. She knew how to host a dinner party, how to dress for a gala, how to move through high society with effortless grace. She was also deeply, genuinely kind. When she married Edsel in 1916, she knew what she was getting into. She'd met Henry Ford. She'd seen how he treated his son, the casual cruelty, the public humiliations. But she loved Edsel. And she believed that together, they could build something different. A family, a life, a home where they controlled the narrative. Stonehurst was supposed to be that home. They moved in during the spring of 1927, just as the gardens were beginning to bloom. Eleanor oversaw every detail of the interior decoration, choosing fabrics, arranging furniture, hanging paintings. Edsel had bought art on their trips to Europe, Renaissance portraits, Impressionist landscapes, modernist sculptures. Eleanor placed them throughout the house, transforming Stonehurst from a showpiece into a home. Their children loved it. Henry Ford II was 14 when they moved in. Old enough to understand the significance of the house, young enough to still run through the gardens with his younger siblings. Benson was 12, Josephine was 10, and William, the baby, was just 6. They had ponies, a boathouse on the lake with a sailboat, endless acres to explore. In summer, the family would have breakfast on the terrace overlooking the water. In winter, they'd gather in the library, a fire crackling, while Eleanor read aloud. From the outside, it looked perfect. But inside the walls, cracks were already forming. Edsel worked constantly. He left for the office before dawn and often didn't return until after the children were asleep. When he was home, he was distant, preoccupied. Eleanor would find him in his study late at night, sketching car designs or staring at financial reports, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Come to bed," she'd whisper. "Soon," he'd say. But he never did. The pressure from Henry hadn't lessened. If anything, it had gotten worse. Henry resented the Model A's success because it proved Edsel had been right about the Model T. So Henry found new ways to undermine his son. He overruled Edsel's decisions on factory management. He publicly sided with Harry Bennett, the brutal enforcer Edsel despised, over his own son. He told executives to ignore Edsel's orders and come to him directly, and worst of all, he visited Stonehurst. It happened in the summer of 1928. Henry and Clara came for Sunday dinner. Eleanor had prepared everything perfectly. Fresh flowers, a menu of Henry's favorite foods, the children scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes. Henry walked through the house slowly. He ran his hand along the oak paneling. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling in the great hall. He inspected the library, the music room, the formal gardens. He said nothing. Finally, as they sat down to dinner, Henry turned to Edsel. $2 million, he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Yes, sir, Edsel said quietly. For a house. Yes, sir. Henry cut his steak, chewing slowly. The silence stretched out, suffocating. The children stared at their plates. Eleanor reached under the table and squeezed Edsel's hand. Finally, Henry looked up. Too much, he said. A man doesn't need all this. Edsel's jaw tightened. I worked for it. You work for me, Henry said. "Don't forget that." He stood up, wiped his mouth, and walked out. Clara followed, murmuring apologies. The car pulled away and Edsel stood on the front steps, watching the taillights disappear. Eleanor came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "He's wrong," she whispered. "You deserve this. You earned it." Edsel didn't respond. He just stood there, staring into the darkness. Because deep down, he wasn't sure she was right. And that doubt, quiet, corrosive, began to eat away at him. For the next 10 years, the Fords played their parts perfectly. To the outside world, they were American royalty. Photographs of the family appeared regularly in the Detroit Free Press and the society pages of national magazines. Edsel and Eleanor at charity galas. The children riding horses on the estate. Stonehurst lit up for Christmas, looking like something out of a fairy tale. They hosted legendary parties. Sunday dinners for 30 guests. Industrialists, artists, politicians. Garden parties in summer where a jazz band played on the terrace and guests danced under strings of lights. Eleanor would play piano in the music room, and people would gather around, champagne in hand, marveling at the elegance of it all. Edsel threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. He couldn't control his father, but he could control his designs. And his designs were extraordinary. In 1932, he pushed Ford into producing the V8 engine. More powerful, more sophisticated than anything on the market. It was a massive success. In 1936, he designed the Lincoln Zephyr, a streamlined, elegant car that looked like it was moving even when standing still. It became one of the most iconic designs in automotive history. In 1939, he convinced the company to start making aircraft engines. When World War II broke out, Ford became one of the largest military contractors in America, building bombers, jeeps, tanks. Edsel personally oversaw much of the production. He was also one of the most generous philanthropists in Detroit. He donated millions to the Detroit Institute of Arts, funding Diego Rivera's famous murals depicting Detroit industry. He supported hospitals, schools, symphony orchestras. He did it quietly, without fanfare, because he genuinely believed in giving back. From the outside, Edsel Ford had everything: wealth, influence, a beautiful family, a magnificent home. But inside Stonehurst, the mask was slipping. Edsel developed severe stomach ulcers. His doctor warned him, "The stress is killing you. You need to rest." But Edsel couldn't rest. Because resting meant thinking. And thinking meant confronting the truth he'd been running from for years. He'd built Stonehurst to prove he was more than Henry Ford's son. To prove he had taste, vision, worth. But his father's visit in 1928 had poisoned it. Every time Edsel walked through the Great Hall, he heard Henry's voice. Too much. A man doesn't need all this. And worse, he'd started to wonder if his father was right. Not about the house, about him. Maybe he was too soft, too sensitive. Maybe he didn't deserve the Ford name. Maybe all the beauty he'd created, the cars, the art, the house, was just window dressing on a fundamental weakness. Eleanor saw it happening. She'd find him sitting alone in his study at 3 in the morning, staring at nothing. She'd beg him to talk to her, to let her help. "I'm fine," he'd say. But he wasn't fine. The children noticed too. Henry II, now a teenager, watched his father grow thinner, quieter, more withdrawn. He'd ask his mother what was wrong. "He works too hard," Eleanor would say. "He just needs rest." But it wasn't rest Edsel needed. It was permission. Permission to stop proving himself. Permission to believe he was enough. And that was the one thing Henry Ford would never give him. So Edsel kept working, kept designing, kept hosting parties at Stonehurst where he smiled and laughed and played the role of the successful heir. And inside, slowly, he began to die. By 1937, Stonehurst had become a stage. Every room was perfectly maintained, every garden path immaculately trimmed. The staff of 10 moved through the house like ghosts, cleaning, polishing, cooking, serving, making sure that everything appeared effortless. That was the key word. Appeared. Because nothing about life at Stonehurst was effortless. It was a performance that required constant vigilance. Eleanor managed the household with military precision. She coordinated meals, supervised the staff, organized social events, made sure the children were properly educated and properly dressed. She also managed Edsel, monitoring his health, shielding him from additional stress, covering for him when he was too exhausted to attend functions. She was, in essence, holding the entire facade together. And she was exhausted. The children were growing up, which brought new complications. Henry II was now 20, attending Yale, already being groomed to eventually take over Ford Motor Company. He came home for holidays and could see the strain in both his parents' faces. But no one talked about it. That wasn't how the Fords operated. Benson was 18, charming and restless. Josephine was 16, artistic like her father. William was 12, still young enough to believe the myth of family perfection. They all played their parts, attended the parties, smiled for photographs, acted like everything was wonderful. But privately, they were watching their father disappear. Edsel's health had deteriorated significantly. The stomach ulcers were constant now. He'd lost weight, nearly 20 pounds. His face had a gray, drawn quality. He took pills for the pain, but they barely helped. His doctors were more insistent. "Mr. Ford, you're going to have a breakdown. Or worse, you need to step back from the company. Take a real vacation. Months, not weeks." Edsel would nod. Promise to consider it. Then go right back to working 16-hour days. Because stepping back wasn't an option. His father was 74 now, increasingly erratic, but still firmly in control of Ford Motor Company. And Harry Bennett, Henry's brutal enforcer, had consolidated power. Bennett ran the company's security forces like a private army. He intimidated workers, spied on executives, and reported everything directly to Henry. Bennett hated Edsel, and the feeling was mutual. Edsel had tried, repeatedly, to have Bennett fired. He'd gone to his father, presented evidence of Bennett's violence and corruption. Henry's response? "Harry's loyal. That's worth more than anything." Translation: Harry does what I say. You don't. So Edsel endured. He designed cars that Bennett tried to sabotage. He advocated for workers that Bennett brutalized. He pushed for modernization while his father and Bennett clung to outdated methods. And Stonehurst, the house he'd built to escape all this, had become just another place where he felt powerless. One evening in late 1937, Eleanor found Edsel in the library. He was sitting in the dark, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. "Darling," she turned on a lamp. "Dinner's ready." "I'm not hungry," she sat beside him. "You have to eat." "I can't." "The pain?" He nodded. She took his hand. It was cold. "We should call the doctor." "No." He pulled away. "I'm fine." "You're not fine, Edsel. You're killing yourself." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that terrified her. Resignation, like he'd already accepted what was coming. "What else can I do?" he whispered. "If I stop, what am I?" "You're my husband, the children's father. I'm Henry Ford's son. That's all I'll ever be." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. "That's not true." But even as she said it, she wondered if he was right. Because everything Edsel had built, the cars, the philanthropy, even Stonehurst, existed in his father's shadow. No matter how brilliant his designs, how generous his donations, how perfect his home, it was always measured against Henry, and Henry's standard was impossible. Be strong but not threatening. Be creative but not too different. Be successful, but remember who's really in charge. It was a trap with no escape, and Edsel was caught in it. The late 1930s brought a series of betrayals that would shatter what remained of Edsel's faith in his father. The first came in 1937, during the Battle of the Overpass. Ford Motor Company was one of the last major automakers refusing to recognize unions. Henry despised unions, saw them as communist infiltration. He'd tasked Harry Bennett with keeping them out by any means necessary. On May 26, 1937, United Auto Workers organizers attempted to distribute pamphlets at the Miller Road overpass outside Ford's River Rouge plant. Bennett's men were waiting. What happened next was captured by newspaper photographers. Bennett's service department thugs, over 40 of them, attacked the union organizers with clubs and fists. They beat men unconscious, kicked them while they were down, threw them down the stairs of the overpass. The photographs ran in newspapers across America. The images were damning, brutal violence, ordered by Ford management against peaceful workers. Edsel was horrified. He'd been in a meeting when it happened, knew nothing about it until he saw the papers. He immediately went to his father. "This is indefensible," Edsel said, throwing the newspaper on Henry's desk. "We have to condemn this. Fire Bennett. Make this right." Henry looked at the photographs, shrugged. "They were trespassing," he said calmly. "Harry was protecting company property. They were distributing pamphlets, and your men nearly killed them. They'll think twice before coming back." Edsel stared at his father, unable to believe what he was hearing. "This makes us look like monsters. This makes us look strong." Henry leaned back in his chair. "You're too soft, Edsel. Always have been. These people don't respect weakness. They respect power. This isn't power, it's thuggery. Call it what you want. Harry stays." Edsel left the office shaking. He tried to issue his own statement condemning the violence, but Henry blocked it. The company's official response was essentially, they had it coming. The incident became a public relations disaster. It energized union organizing across the country, and it cemented in Edsel's mind that his father cared more about control than morality, more than his own son's judgment. The second betrayal came in 1938, and it was more personal. Edsel had been working for years on a revolutionary new car, the Lincoln Continental. It was his masterpiece, sleek, elegant, powerful. European sophistication combined with American engineering. He'd overseen every detail personally. When it was unveiled in 1939, it was immediately recognized as one of the most beautiful cars ever designed. Celebrities bought them. Presidents rode in them. Automotive historians called it a work of art. Henry's response? He told reporters he'd approved the design himself, that it was based on his vision, that Edsel had merely executed what he'd been told to do. It was a lie. Everyone in the company knew it was a lie, but Henry said it, publicly, repeatedly, and Edsel said nothing. Because what could he say? Contradict his father in the press? Call him a liar? He'd lose. He always lost. So he swallowed it. Added it to the pile of humiliations he'd been swallowing for 20 years. But this one hurt more than the others. Because the Continental wasn't just a car. It was proof that Edsel had vision, talent, worth. And his father had stolen even that. Eleanor watched her husband retreat further into himself. He stopped talking about work, stopped sketching designs at home. When friends came to Stonehurst for dinner, he'd sit quietly, offering polite smiles but contributing little to conversation. "He's not himself," one guest whispered to Eleanor. "He's tired," she said. "Just tired." But it was more than tiredness. Edsel was disappearing. Not physically, not yet, but spiritually. The light that had once animated him, the passion for beauty and design, was dimming. And there was nothing Eleanor could do to stop it. In the spring of 1938, Edsel collapsed at work. He'd been in a meeting, reviewing production numbers, when suddenly he couldn't breathe. Pain radiated from his stomach through his chest. He tried to stand and his legs gave out. They rushed him to the hospital. The diagnosis, severe gastric ulcers, complicated by what the doctors called nervous exhaustion. In modern terms, it was a stress-induced breakdown. His body had been screaming at him to stop for years, and he'd ignored it. Now it was forcing the issue. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Henry visited once, stayed 10 minutes, and told Edsel to toughen up. Eleanor stayed by his bedside day and night. When he was finally released, the doctors were blunt. "Mr. Ford, you need to make a choice. Either you dramatically reduce your workload and stress levels, or you won't live to see 50. Edsel was 44. He promised to slow down, promised to delegate more, promised to take better care of himself. He kept none of those promises, because the fundamental problem hadn't changed. Henry was still in control. Bennett was still undermining him. The company was still being mismanaged, and if Edsel stepped back, it would only get worse, so he went back to work. Back to the 16-hour days, back to fighting battles he couldn't win. And his body continued to break down. By 1941, he'd developed a new symptom: undulant fever. It came in waves: chills, sweating, severe joint pain. The doctors were baffled at first, then identified it as brucellosis, a bacterial infection usually contracted from unpasteurized milk. Henry Ford, in his increasingly eccentric old age, had become obsessed with natural living. He insisted the family drink unpasteurized milk from his farms. Despite warnings from doctors that it was unsafe, Henry refused to pasteurize. Edsel had contracted brucellosis from his father's milk. The irony was almost poetic. The fever weakened him further. He lost more weight. His face became gaunt. He moved slowly, like a much older man. And then, in late 1942, came the diagnosis that would kill him: cancer, stomach cancer, advanced. The doctors told Eleanor first, asked her how she wanted to tell Edsel. She went home to Stonehurst and walked through the house they'd built together. The great hall where they'd hosted hundreds of guests, the music room where she'd played piano while he listened, eyes closed, finally at peace, the library where they'd read to the children, the gardens where they'd walked on summer evenings, planning a future that now would never come. She found Edsel in his study, reviewing blueprints for a new Ford factory. "Darling," she said softly, "we need to talk." He looked up, saw her face, and immediately knew. "How long?" he asked. "They don't know. Months. Maybe a year if the treatment works." He nodded slowly, set down his pen, looked around his study, at the car sketches on the walls, the models on the shelves, the photographs of Stonehurst's construction. "I wanted to finish so many things," he said quietly. Eleanor knelt beside his chair, took his hands. "You've done enough, Edsel. You've done more than enough." But they both knew that wasn't true, because for Edsel, it had never been enough. And now, he'd run out of time to prove otherwise. Edsel Ford spent his last year trying to protect the people he loved from the empire that was killing him. He couldn't save himself. The cancer was too advanced, spreading too quickly. But he could try to save his sons, especially Henry II, from the same trap he'd been caught in. He called Henry II home from the Navy in late 1942. His oldest son was 25 now, strong and confident in ways Edsel had never been. They sat together in the library at Stonehurst, and Edsel spoke more honestly than he ever had before. "When I'm gone," Edsel said, "your grandfather is going to try to control you the way he controlled me." "I won't let him," Henry II said firmly. "It's not that simple. He'll use the company, the family name, your inheritance. He'll make you feel like you owe him everything." "I don't owe him anything." Edsel smiled sadly. "I said the same thing at your age." He gripped his son's hand. "Promise me something. When the time comes, you'll do what I couldn't. You'll fight him. You'll take real control, and you'll fire Harry Bennett the first chance you get. I promise. And promise me you'll take care of your mother and your siblings. Don't let this company destroy this family any more than it already has." Henry II's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, promise me." "I promise." Edsel nodded, exhausted. That's all I needed to hear. The treatments were brutal. Radiation, experimental drugs. They made him violently ill and barely slowed the cancer's spread. By the spring of 1943, Edsel was bedridden. Eleanor moved into the room next to his so she could be nearby at night. The children visited constantly. Friends came to pay their respects, though Edsel was often too weak to see them. Henry Ford came once a week. He'd sit in a chair beside Edsel's bed and talk about the company. Production numbers, new designs, factory expansions. As if his son wasn't dying. As if everything was normal. One afternoon, Eleanor lost her composure. "Henry, please," she said sharply. "He doesn't need to hear about work. He needs to rest." Henry looked at her, genuinely confused. "This is what he cares about." "No," Eleanor said, voice shaking. "This is what you care about. He needs his father, not his boss." Henry stood up, offended. "I'm here, aren't I?" You're here, but you're not here. He left without saying goodbye to Edsel. It was the last time they spoke. In late May, Edsel took a turn for the worse. The doctors said it was a matter of days. The family gathered at Stonehurst, all 4 children, Eleanor, close friends. They took turns sitting with him, holding his hand, saying goodbye. On May 26, 1943, exactly 6 years to the day after the Battle of the Overpass, Edsel Ford died. He was 49 years old. Eleanor was with him at the end. She held his hand and whispered, "You can rest now, darling. You can finally rest." His last words were barely audible. "Take care of them." "I will. The house. I'll take care of everything." He closed his eyes, and then he was gone. Eleanor sat with his body for an hour before telling the children. She needed that time alone with him, to say all the things she'd never been able to say while Henry Ford's shadow loomed over them. "You were enough," she whispered. "You were always enough." They held the funeral at Stonehurst. It was what Edsel would have wanted, to be remembered in the house he'd built, surrounded by the beauty he'd created. 3,000 people came. They filled the great hall, spilled into the gardens, lined the driveway. Industrialists and artists, workers from Ford plants, society figures from Grosse Pointe, representatives from the museums and charities Edsel had supported. The casket sat in the great hall beneath the vaulted ceiling. Flowers covered every surface. Thousands of arrangements sent from around the world. Eleanor stood beside it in black, her children around her. They were numb, moving through the rituals mechanically. Henry Ford arrived late, supported by aides. He was 79 now, physically frail but still mentally sharp when he wanted to be. He walked slowly to the casket and stood there for a long time, staring at his son's face. People watched, wondering if he'd finally show some emotion, some recognition of what he'd done. Henry's shoulders shook. He was crying. For a moment, the room felt the weight of genuine grief. Maybe, people thought, he understood. Maybe he regretted the years of cruelty. Maybe he realized he'd destroyed the best thing in his life. Then Henry turned to one of his aides and said, loud enough for several people to hear, "He was too soft. That's what killed him." Eleanor heard it. So did Henry II. Eleanor's face remained perfectly composed, but her hands clenched into fists. Henry II stepped forward, ready to confront his grandfather, but Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Not here," she whispered. "Not now." The service was dignified and brief. A minister spoke about Edsel's generosity, his artistic vision, his devotion to family. Diego Rivera sent a telegram praising Edsel's support of the arts. Representatives from the Detroit Institute of Arts described how his donations had transformed the museum. But the eulogies felt incomplete. Because they couldn't talk about the real Edsel Ford, the man trapped between brilliance and expectation, who'd spent his entire life trying to prove himself to someone who would never be satisfied. They buried him in the family plot at Woodlawn Cemetery. Hundreds stood in the rain as the casket was lowered into the ground. Henry Ford stood apart from the rest of the family under an umbrella held by Harry Bennett. That image, Henry Ford at his son's graveside, protected by the man Edsel had despised, was captured by photographers. It ran in newspapers across America. People saw it and understood something without being told. Edsel Ford had been defeated, not by cancer, by his father. After the burial, the family returned to Stonehurst. Eleanor walked through the rooms now filled with mourners, eating and drinking and sharing memories. She felt like a ghost in her own home. Henry II found her in the library, staring at the photographs on the walls. Pictures of Edsel with his cars, Edsel with the children, Edsel on the day they'd moved into Stonehurst, young and hopeful and not yet broken. "Mom," Henry II said gently, "you should sit down." "I can't stay here," she said suddenly. "What?" "In this house, I can't stay here." "Mom, this is your home." She turned to him and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. This house killed him, not the cancer. This. All of this. That's not true. He built it to prove something. To his father, to the world, to himself. And it was never enough. Nothing was ever enough. She walked to the window, looking out at the gardens. I loved this place once, but now all I see is how much it cost him. Henry II didn't know what to say, because she was right. Eleanor stayed at Stonehurst for a few more weeks, helping settle Edsel's estate and affairs. Then, quietly, she moved to a smaller house nearby. She took her personal belongings, some photographs, a few pieces of furniture. She left almost everything else behind. I don't need it, she told the children. I never did. The question was, what would happen to Stonehurst now? For 7 years after Edsel's death, Stonehurst stood frozen in time. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to sell it immediately. The children weren't ready to let it go. So the house remained, 60 rooms, fully staffed, perfectly maintained, but empty of the family that had given it life. The staff still came every day. They dusted the furniture, polished the silver, tended the gardens. They prepared meals that no one ate in a dining room where no one sat. It was a kind of madness, really. Keeping a house alive for ghosts. Eleanor visited occasionally, always briefly. She'd walk through the rooms, touching surfaces, remembering. Then she'd leave quickly, as if staying too long would trap her there. The children came more often, especially Henry II. He'd bring his own family, his wife Anne, and their daughters. They'd spend weekends at Stonehurst, trying to create new memories to replace the painful ones. But it never quite worked, because the house wasn't just a building, it was a monument to unfulfilled promises. Every perfect detail, every carefully chosen stone, every manicured garden path whispered the same message. This wasn't enough. He wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. Henry II understood this in ways his younger siblings didn't. He'd watched his father build Stonehurst, watched him hope it would finally earn his grandfather's approval, watched that hope die slowly, room by room. After Edsel's death, Henry II had done what his father couldn't. He'd fought back. When Henry Ford had tried to put Harry Bennett in charge of the company, Henry II had threatened to walk away entirely, taking the family's stock and support with him. It was the first time anyone had successfully stood up to the old man. Henry Ford, faced with losing control completely, had relented. Harry Bennett was fired. Henry II became executive vice president, then president. In 1945, Henry Ford finally retired. He died 2 years later in 1947, at age 83. Henry II had won the battle his father had fought his entire life. But the victory felt hollow, because Edsel should have been there to see it, should have been the one to finally break free. Instead, he died still trapped. And Stonehurst was the physical embodiment of that trap. By 1950, the financial reality could no longer be ignored. The house cost a fortune to maintain. Property taxes had tripled since the war. The staff's salaries, the utilities, the endless repairs. It was bleeding money. More importantly, nobody wanted to live there. Eleanor had her own home. Henry II had built a modern house better suited to his young family. Benson, Josephine, and William had their own lives, their own homes. Stonehurst had become an expensive monument to a past no one wanted to remember. Eleanor made the decision. We're selling it. The children agreed. It was time. They put it on the market in the spring of 1950. Asking price, $250,000. It was a fraction of what Edsel had paid to build it, barely 1/8 of the original cost. But the real estate agent was blunt. Mrs. Ford, this kind of estate, nobody builds these anymore, and nobody wants to maintain them. Someone will want it, Eleanor said. It's beautiful. It's expensive and impractical and... He hesitated. And what? And it reminds people of an era everyone wants to forget. He was right. The late 1940s and early 1950s were the age of suburban expansion. Young families wanted ranch houses with picture windows and modern appliances. They wanted simplicity, efficiency, the future, not some English manor that required a staff of 10 and cost as much to heat as a small factory. The Gilded Age was over. The era of grand estates was done. People wanted to move forward, not backward. Stonehurst sat on the market for months, then years. A hotel chain considered it. They walked through, took measurements, did cost projections. Too expensive to convert. The location was wrong for a resort. They passed. A private college looked at it. Beautiful building, they said, but too far from campus, too expensive to maintain as a satellite property. They passed. A hospital evaluated using it as a sanatorium. Too small for their needs, too grand for medical purposes. They passed. One by one, potential buyers walked through Stonehurst and walked away. By 1954, the price had dropped to $100,000. Still no offers. The house came off the market. The decision was made to leave it closed until someone, someday, wanted it. The staff was dismissed. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The windows were boarded. And Stonehurst, the monument Edsel Ford had built to prove his worth, became a tomb. Abandoned houses die slowly. At first, the changes are subtle. Dust accumulates on surfaces. Spiderwebs appear in corners. The air becomes stale and heavy. Then, the larger decay begins. Without heat in winter, pipes freeze and burst. Water seeps into walls. Without ventilation in summer, humidity builds and mold blooms. Without maintenance, roofs develop leaks. Rain finds its way inside. Stonehurst decayed faster than most because it was so large. 60 rooms, impossible to secure completely. Vandals found ways in. By 1956, local teenagers knew about the old Ford mansion. It became a destination for dares and late-night adventures. They'd pry open boarded windows, slip inside with flashlights. What they found was eerie. The Great Hall was still magnificent, even in ruin. The vaulted ceiling, the grand staircase, the carved oak paneling, all still there, but covered in dust and graffiti. Someone had spray-painted Ford's Folly in red letters across one wall. The music room's Steinway was gone, stolen. The silk wall coverings were shredded. In the library, most of the first editions had been taken or destroyed. Pages scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Upstairs, the bedrooms were shells. Thieves had stripped the copper wiring, stolen light fixtures, pried up sections of hardwood floor. What remained was picked over by scavengers looking for anything valuable. The gardens were the saddest part. Jens Jensen's carefully designed landscapes had gone wild. The prairie plants had spread uncontrollably. The formal hedges were overgrown, twisted shapes. The fountain in the sunken garden was cracked, filled with stagnant water and dead leaves. But nature had its own beauty. Wildflowers bloomed among the ruins. Birds nested in the eaves. Deer wandered through what had once been formal gardens, finding shelter in the abandoned paradise. Local residents drove by occasionally, pointing out the boarded windows to their children. "That's where the Fords used to live," they'd say. What happened to it? Nobody wanted it. It was a sad epitaph for a house that had cost $2 million and represented a man's entire hope for legacy. In 1959, that photograph was taken, the one that ran in the Detroit Free Press. The photographer had written about his visit. Walking through Stonehurst is like visiting Pompeii. Everything frozen in the moment life stopped. You can still see the grandeur, the ambition, but it's all fading. And you realize, this is what happens when we build monuments to ourselves instead of homes for our families. They outlive their purpose, and then they just disappear. The article caught the attention of a real estate developer named Marcus Bellingham. He wasn't interested in the house. He was interested in the land. Marcus Bellingham understood something most people didn't in 1959. Lakefront property was about to become extraordinarily valuable. Post-war prosperity meant more people could afford nice homes. The suburbs were exploding, and everyone wanted to live near water. Grosse Pointe, with its Lake St. Clair shoreline, was prime real estate. A single acre of waterfront land could be subdivided into multiple lots, each selling for a premium. The math was simple and profitable. He'd been watching Stonehurst for years, waiting for the price to drop low enough to make sense. In the fall of 1959, he made an offer. $50,000 for the entire property. The Ford family's real estate attorney brought the offer to Eleanor. "It's insulting," the attorney said. The house alone is worth more than that. Eleanor looked at the paperwork. What would he do with it? Demolish the house, subdivide the land, build a dozen suburban homes. Demolish it? Yes, ma'am. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Edsel standing on those front steps in 1927, proud and hopeful, and not yet broken. She thought about Sunday dinners, garden parties, the sound of her children's laughter echoing through those halls. She thought about how much that house had cost, not just in money, but in everything else. Accept the offer, she said. Mrs. Ford, accept it. Let it be done. The attorney tried to argue. They could find another buyer. Someone who'd preserve it. Maybe donate it to the city for a museum. But Eleanor was firm. I don't want it preserved. I don't want it to become a monument. I want it to be gone. May I ask why? She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. Because my husband built that house trying to prove he was enough, and it killed him. I won't let it become a shrine to that lie. The sale closed in December 1959. Marcus Bellingham took possession of Stonehurst on January 15, 1960. He walked through it once, took some photographs for his records, and made notes about salvage values. The limestone could be sold. Some of the interior would, if not too damaged. The rest would be demolished and hauled away. He hired a wrecking crew to start work in March, as soon as the weather cleared. On March 12, 1960, they arrived at dawn. 3 bulldozers, a crane, a crew of 20 men. They started with the gardens. The gardens went first. Jensen's carefully designed prairies, the sunken garden with its fountain, the birch groves, bulldozed in a single day. The machines rolled through, pushing everything into piles. Trees that had taken 30 years to grow were uprooted in minutes. By the end of that first day, the landscape was flat. Raw earth waiting for suburban lawns. The house took longer. They started with the roof, pulling off the Welsh slate tiles. Then, the upper floors, working their way down. The children's bedrooms, the servants' quarters, the guest wings, all collapsed into rubble. The work was methodical, dangerous too. The men had to be careful about the structure's integrity as they dismantled it. One wrong move could bring down a wall on someone. They salvaged what they could. The limestone was sold to a building supplier. Some of the interior oak paneling went to an architectural salvage company. The brass fixtures, the remaining light fixtures, anything of value was stripped out. But most of it was just destroyed. The music room where Eleanor had played Chopin, smashed. The library where Edsel had kept his first editions, demolished. The great hall with its vaulted ceiling collapsed into a pile of timber and stone. Local residents came to watch. Some were curious, some were sad. A few took photographs, sensing that something significant was disappearing. One elderly woman stood at the edge of the property crying. A reporter asked her why. My husband worked on building that house, she said. He was a stonemason. He spent 2 years cutting and fitting that limestone. He was so proud of his work. He used to bring us here to show the children. I built that, he'd say. And now, she couldn't finish. The reporter wrote it down. The quote ran in a small article in the local paper. Wrecking crew tears down Ford mansion. Most people didn't notice. It was just another old building coming down. Detroit was changing. Out with the old, in with the new. By late April, the Great Hall was gone. By early May, the first floor was rubble. By the end of May, only the foundation remained, a vast concrete scar on the earth. They broke up the foundation with jackhammers, hauled away the chunks. Then they brought in clean fill dirt, graded the land smooth, and divided it into 12 lots. By June 15, 1960, less than 3 months after the wrecking crew arrived, Stonehurst was gone. Completely gone. No trace remained. No marker, no plaque. Nothing to indicate that one of America's grandest estates had ever stood there. Marcus Bellingham sold the lots within a year. 12 families built ranch houses. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, attached garages. They moved in with their children and their station wagons and their dreams of suburban prosperity. They were happy there. The location was beautiful. The lake views were stunning. Their children played in yards where Edsel Ford's children had once played. None of them knew what had been there before, because nobody told them. Eleanor Ford never drove past that street again. She lived until 1976, dying at age 83. She spent her final years quietly, supporting the charities Edsel had cared about, spending time with her grandchildren, trying to remember the good moments and forget the painful ones. When reporters asked her about Stonehurst in her later years, she gave brief, polite answers. It was a beautiful house. We had many happy times there. But it was just a house? She never told them the whole truth, that Stonehurst had been both a dream and a prison, that it represented everything her husband had hoped to be and everything that had destroyed him. Some truths are too painful to share. The Ford family moved on. Henry Ford II led the company through its most successful decades. The Lincoln Continental, Edsel's design, became one of the most iconic American cars ever made. Presidents rode in them, so did movie stars. Each one bore Edsel's fingerprints, his vision of what a car could be. The Detroit Institute of Arts, built largely on Edsel's donations, became one of the finest museums in America. The Diego Rivera murals he commissioned are now considered masterpieces. Millions of people have stood before them, awed by their power and beauty. They don't know that they exist because a man who felt powerless wanted to create something lasting, something that would matter. And it did. The Ford Foundation, established by Edsel and expanded after his death, has given away billions of dollars, supporting education, the arts, social justice, scientific research. It's one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world. Edsel's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren have continued that tradition. The Ford name is still associated with generosity, culture, vision. All the things Edsel valued. All the things his father couldn't see. In 1978, automotive historian David Lewis published a biography of Edsel Ford. It was the first comprehensive account of his life, drawing on family interviews and company archives. The book revealed the full extent of Henry's cruelty and Edsel's suffering. Readers were shocked. The gentleman who designed beautiful cars and supported the arts had been systematically destroyed by his own father, and the world had barely noticed. The book changed Edsel's reputation. He went from being a footnote in his father's story to being recognized as a tragic figure in his own right, a man of genuine talent and vision, crushed by impossible expectations. But one question remained. Why had he endured it? Why hadn't he fought back? Why hadn't he left? Lewis interviewed Eleanor Ford before she died. He asked her directly. Because he loved his father, she said simply. Despite everything, he kept hoping Henry would finally see him, really see him, and approve. Did he ever? No. Did Edsel ever stop hoping? Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Not until the very end. That's the real tragedy of Edsel Ford. Not that he died young, not that he was overshadowed by his father, but that he spent his entire life seeking approval from someone constitutionally incapable of giving it. And Stonehurst was the physical embodiment of that futile quest. In 2024, a historian researching Grosse Pointe estates discovered the photograph from 1928. Edsel standing in front of Stonehurst, young and hopeful, believing he'd finally built something that would last. She posted it on social media with a brief explanation of the house's history. It went viral. Hundreds of thousands of people saw it, and they understood instinctively what it represented. The comments poured in. I never knew this existed. Why isn't this taught in schools? This is what happens when parents destroy their children. He deserved so much better. I'm crying. This is so tragic. My father was like this. Always criticizing, never satisfied. I spent my whole life trying to please him. The photograph touched something deep and universal. Because almost everyone has felt what Edsel felt. Not enough. Never enough. Chasing approval from someone who won't give it. The historian received hundreds of messages. People sharing their own stories. Fathers who demanded perfection. Mothers who withheld love. Spouses, bosses, friends, people in their lives who made them feel small. Thank you for telling Edsel's story, one person wrote. It helped me understand my own. That's the strange power of tragedy. It connects us, reminds us we're not alone in our pain. Edsel Ford has been dead for over 80 years. Stonehurst has been gone for over 60. But the story still resonates because the wound it reveals is timeless. The need to be seen, valued, enough, and the devastation that comes when that need goes unmet. Today, if you drive down Lakeshore Drive in Grosse Pointe, you'll pass those 12 ranch houses. They're modest by the area's standards. Nice, but not extraordinary. If you didn't know, you'd never guess that one of America's grandest estates once stood there. But if you look carefully, if you know what to look for, you can still see traces. The old trees at the property edges, survivors from Jensen's landscapes. A slight elevation change where the gardens once descended to the lake. A section of the original driveway still visible beneath newer pavement. Fragments. Echoes. Ghosts. A local historical society put up a small marker in 2015, near where Stonehurst's entrance had been. It reads, Stonehurst Estate, 1927-1960, home of Edsel Ford. Automotive designer, philanthropist, patron of the arts. His vision shaped American culture. His generosity enriched Detroit. His legacy endures. It's a nice sentiment, true in its way, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Because Edsel Ford's real legacy isn't the cars or the art or the philanthropy, as important as those are. His real legacy is the warning his life offers. Don't build monuments to prove your worth. Don't sacrifice your health, your happiness, your family trying to satisfy someone who can't be satisfied. Don't let someone else's opinion, even a parent's, even someone you love, define whether you're enough. Because you are enough, exactly as you are. Stonehurst couldn't prove Edsel's worth because his worth didn't need proving. It existed independent of his father's approval, independent of the house, independent of anything external. But Edsel never believed that, and it killed him. And in the end, the house he built, that magnificent doomed monument, couldn't escape the same fate. What was once untouchable slipped into obscurity. What was built to last forever disappeared in weeks. What seemed permanent proved painfully fragile. But here's what did last. The Continental that still turns heads on city streets. The museum galleries filled with art he made possible. The students educated by foundations he established. The children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who carry his name and continue his values. And the story. This story. Because stories, the true ones, the ones that reveal something essential about being human, those do last. They last because we need them. We need to hear about Edsel Ford so we can learn from his tragedy. So we can choose differently. So we can build our lives on love instead of pressure, on self-worth instead of external validation. So we can understand that some legacies can't be demolished, but only if they're built on the right foundation. Not stone, not wealth, not perfection, but truth, kindness. The quiet belief that we're enough, and always were. The photograph from 1928 hangs now in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Visitors stop before it, studying Edsel's face, trying to read what he was thinking. Was he happy that day? Proud? Did he have any sense of what was coming? A tour guide tells groups, "This is Edsel Ford at Stonehurst, the estate he built in Grosse Pointe. The house is gone now, but Edsel's contributions to American design and culture remain influential." Most visitors nod and move on, but occasionally someone lingers, looks longer, sees something in Edsel's eyes that the tour guide didn't mention, and they understand. This isn't just a photograph of a man in a house, it's a photograph of hope. And the moment before that hope began to die. It's a photograph of every person who's ever tried to build something beautiful while carrying an impossible weight. It's a photograph of America itself, ambitious, brilliant, generous, but also broken by the same pressures that broke Edsel Ford. The pressure to be more, have more, prove more. To build monuments instead of homes. To sacrifice everything at the altar of success. And it's a photograph of what we lose when we forget the difference between worth and worthiness, between having enough and being enough, between building a legacy and living a life. Stonehurst is gone. But the lesson it taught, if we're willing to learn it, remains. Some houses fall, some empires crumble, some monuments disappear. But the best of us, the part that truly matters, leaves something no wrecking crew can touch. Love, vision, truth, the courage to be imperfect, the wisdom to know when enough is enough, and the grace to forgive ourselves for being human. That's what lasts. That's what endures. That's what Edsel Ford, in the end, gave us. Not a house, but a truth we desperately needed to hear. The end.